In this screencast, we're going to introduce the nervous system and the base component part of that being the nervous cell or a neuron. Nervous system is an important regulation or regulating system in the body. Every time you move a muscle and every time you think a thought, your nerve cells are working. They're processing information, receiving signals, deciding what to do with them, dispatching new messages to their surroundings, to their neighbors. Some nerve cells are going to communicate directly with muscle cells or glandular cells, telling muscles to contract, glandular cells to secrete important chemicals, and still other neurons are they pretty much live their entire life just communicating only with other nerve cells. And they do it very fast, and normally they do it very, very efficiently. So if you think about it for a minute, what you have going on in your body that your nervous system takes care of is essentially every physiological process. And you don't really think about it, but it is essential for survival. Even in these pictures, characteristics that animals need in their nervous system. And it has to be these things. In order for it to be fast, it actually has to reset quickly, which we'll talk about down the line when we talk about neural transmission or sending messages and impulses. It has to be extremely accurate. For survival, you don't have time to make those mistakes. And so the nervous system characteristics that this bird of prey needs are maybe a little bit different than what this bunny is going to need. And although these pictures don't necessarily go together, we can see that one individual's nervous system won out. So again, the base cell of the nervous system is called the neuron. And the neuron, or the nerve cell, is really a unique cell. Probably the number one characteristic that a neuron has is that it has the ability to be excitable. It is physiologically excitable. In other words, it is able to receive a stimulus and then pass that message on, which again we're going to, in a later screencast, we'll talk about that message sending process. But a neuron has all of these features that you need to be familiar with, and you need to get familiar with them rather quickly. But the main part of the body of the cell, called the cell body, is where most of your organelles are going to be, the typical membrane-bound specializing compartments in a cell. But it also has all of these branches. The receiving branches are called dendrites, and the sending branch, which typically a neuron is going to only have one of these. It can have more, however, depending on the neuron type. But in a basic cell, we'll say it has just one of them. And the direction of the signal is always a one-way street. So this isn't exactly like an electrical wire that you could send an impulse or send a message or send an electric signal through either way. In a neuron, it's a one-way street. And if we go back to these branches, each one of these has the ability to make a connection with another cell. Each one of these little branches could have a connection with another neuron. These could be, depending on the type of neuron, could be naked nerve endings that are in your skin, hooking up to all sorts of receptors in the body. And each one of the branches of the axon, then, are also able to connect with another effector cell. They could hook up to a muscle. They could hook up to individual muscle cells to stimulate a muscle. They could hook up to glandular cells, or maybe to another neuron. So all of these branches make the neuron a pretty complex cell. As we said before, the neuron is a very specialized cell, and it's extremely important to animal life. And these aren't so important to really know, but they can get rather long. And really what we're talking about is the axon of these cells. So the cell body would typically be housed maybe in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord, and you have the axon. It could be reaching all the way out to the tippy toe or to all the way up into the head of a giraffe or whatever it may be, or depending on the direction, whether it is incoming information or outgoing information. But these connector parts, the axon of each neuron, can be very long depending on the animal. As we start to talk about the transmission of a signal, we'll look at it more in depth in the future, but just to think about how it travels, first of all, the signal has to travel from point A to point B. Now there's a slight exception to that we'll talk about with higher animal neurons, but it isn't something that travels by Wi-Fi. It isn't something that travels in the cloud or gets beamed from one place to the next. There actually has to be a physical signal that travels from one point in the nervous system to the next. And we think about this as a row of dominoes. To start the signal, you have to get the first domino to fall. Now think about just triggering the signal for a second. Think about standing up a domino and just barely tapping it enough to get it wobbling, not to fall, but to get it to wobble. At some point, you'd push it hard enough so that it starts to fall. And the propagation of that signal is going to be basically an all or none situation. As soon as it does fall, there's not much you can do other than physically block the signal to stop it from traveling down the row of dominoes. Once you get the first one to fall, they all will fall down. But the action is just the falling of the dominoes along the point, from point A to point B along the line. And before you can actually do it, you have to set them up again. So when I was playing with dominoes as a kid, it was cool to knock them down, but it took a lot of work to go back and reset them. Well, you have to reset that axon before it can receive and send another signal. So much like a row of dominoes, a neuron is very similar. Remember our old friends, the protein channels that are embedded in the cell membrane of a neuron. There's a whole string of these things, and once the first one is opened, like the row of dominoes, the rest will open in succession. And again, like the row of dominoes, there's really no stopping it. It's called all or nothing response. Once this neuron is stimulated to send a signal, the signal will be propagated through the entire length of the neuron. And that wave action is really what the signal is what a nervous impulse is. And so then we actually have to reset those channels so that the neuron can be stimulated and send a message again. Let's look at a neuron at rest. A neuron at rest is charged. There is, as it says here, a sea of charged ions. Well, on the inside of a cell, there are more negatively charged anions. And on the outside, there are more positively charged ions. So the anions are more concentrated within the cell, inside of the cell. And down here you see a drawing of a cell. The positive ions are more concentrated outside of the cell. Neurons then actually have a voltage, and that voltage is set up because of the opposite charges on the cell membrane. So the membrane is said to be polarized. You want to be familiar with that term. It's polarized. Negative on the outside, positive on the inside. So this sets up a gradient. So this is an imbalanced situation. This is an imbalanced condition. The positively charged ions repel each other, as do the negatively charged ions. So they want, quote unquote, to flow down their electrical gradient and mix together evenly. So they really want to change places here, but they can't because of the gated channels. So this means that there is actually energy that should be stored there. Just like we dam up water behind a dam on a river, there is potential energy there. And this voltage is a measurement of that stored electrical energy. So the voltage is actually the measurement of the difference in concentration here across that cell membrane, the difference in the concentration of the charges. So an unstimulated neuron is going to have a resting potential. Remember, there's potential energy there. So we call that the resting potential. And you can measure it with a voltmeter, and it's not particularly strong. I mean, we're talking millivolts, but it's around negative 70 millivolts. This negative charge here is simply referring to the fact that the inside of the cell is electrically negative. The negative charge lies on the inside of that cell. Therefore, the resting potential is negative. So to finish up, what you should be able to do is you should be able to, you should be able to draw a neuron and essentially label its parts. And it doesn't have to be fancy, but you should be able to label all of the parts of a neuron and also tell what each individual part does. And secondly, I wanted you to be able to describe the resting potential of a neuron, the resting potential and why a neuron is charged or said to have a resting potential across the cell membrane.